What if the collapse of Europe is not a future threat, but a process already unfolding in front of us, stage by stage, exactly as history has shown in every major breakdown of empires, currencies, and economic systems? What if Greece, Turkey, and Italy are not isolated crises, but the visible cracks of a pattern that has repeated itself for centuries, always ignored until it is too late? This is the question that sets the tone for everything that follows, because once you recognize the pattern, you can no longer unsee it. Europe is not drifting randomly, it is following the same structural trajectory that toppled past global powers, and the signs are not subtle. They are loud, accelerating, and deeply interconnected. For years, analysts have tried to explain each European crisis as a unique event, a local failure, a political misstep. But when you zoom out and observe the system as a whole, a different picture emerges. The currency fragility of the Eurozone, the demographic implosion, the repeated sovereign debt spirals, the geopolitical overextensions, the internal fragmentation between rich and poor member states, the rise of extremist movements, the weakening of institutional trust. All these elements form a sequence that mirrors the seven-stage collapse pattern described by historians who examined the downfall of empires from the Habsburgs to the Ottomans, from Britain to the Soviet Union. Europe today is already deep inside that sequence, and pretending otherwise is part of the danger. Greece shows the fiscal exhaustion stage. Turkey reveals the institutional erosion stage. Italy exposes the unsustainable debt productivity gap. Each country reflects a different fragment of the same systemic deterioration. And as these pieces interact, they amplify one another. It is no longer about a country being weak. It is about a continent hitting the critical threshold where economic stress transforms into political volatility, and political volatility fractures the social fabric. As you process these signals, think about your own experience. What signs have you personally felt or observed in recent years? You can share them below, because these real perceptions matter more than official reports, and understanding this content becomes easier when everyone contributes. If this opening made sense to you, make sure to leave a comment sharing your perspective. Hit the like button to help this investigation reach more people, and check if you are already subscribed so you do not miss the next steps of this collapse pattern as it unfolds. And now, as we move forward, the deeper layers of this pattern begin to reveal why Europe has reached a point where the trajectory can no longer be dismissed. When you look back at the major collapses that shaped world history, what stands out is not the uniqueness of each event, but how eerily similar their trajectories were. The fall of empires rarely begins with a dramatic moment. It begins quietly, with subtle economic distortions that accumulate over decades, until the weight of those distortions becomes unbearable. Europe today mirrors those early phases with alarming precision, and once you recognize the mechanics, it becomes impossible to ignore how predictable the sequence really is. Each crisis that Europe has faced over the last 15 years has been treated as an isolated accident, yet every one of them fits neatly into the historical blueprint of collapse. The pattern always starts with structural imbalance. In the past, it was overextension, unsustainable military costs, or fragile tax systems. In modern Europe, it takes the form of persistent sovereign debt accumulation, negative demographic trends, and a currency union that amplifies weaknesses instead of absorbing them. The euro was designed to unify economies, but in practice, it exposed the disparities between productive and unproductive nations. Strong economies like Germany and the Netherlands pull ahead, while weaker ones like Greece, Portugal, and Italy sink deeper into dependency. This divergence is not a temporary consequence of mismanagement. It is a built-in flaw that resembles the internal fragmentation that doomed previous empires when their peripheries could no longer keep pace with their cores. Another key stage in historical collapses is the illusion of stability that precedes the breaking point. Europe has lived inside this illusion for years, propped up by low interest rates, emergency monetary interventions, and political narratives that insisted the worst was behind us. But history shows that artificial stability is always temporary. It buys time, not solutions. The same happened in the final decades of the Ottoman Empire, when reforms delayed the decline but failed to reverse structural decay. It happened in the late Soviet Union, where temporary economic bandages masked a system already hollowed out from within. Europe's reliance on monetary stimulus and institutional reassurance follows the same script, creating a comforting surface over a deteriorating foundation. And then there is the overlooked but critical factor, the loss of economic resilience. Every collapsed system shared a moment when productivity stagnated while obligations continued to grow. Europe is experiencing that exact dynamic. Aging populations, shrinking workforces, declining competitiveness, and rising fiscal commitments form a pressure cooker with no release valve. The machine keeps running, but each cycle demands more energy than the last. It is the same friction that once signaled the irreversible weakening of imperial structures, the point at which decline stops being theoretical and becomes structural reality. These repeated signals are not random. They are the hallmarks of systems entering the middle stages of the collapse pattern, and Europe has crossed enough thresholds that the next transitions become easier to foresee. The deeper you look, the more the historical parallels sharpen, making it clear that the forces shaping Europe's trajectory today are not anomalies, but symptoms of a cycle that has played out many times before. As the structural weaknesses accumulate, another element of the collapse pattern becomes unavoidable: the internal tensions that surface when an economic system begins to strain under pressures it can no longer absorb. Europe today reflects this phase with striking clarity, and once these tensions emerge, they rarely retreat. Instead, they interact, compound, and eventually reshape the political and economic landscape in ways that mirror the early rupture points seen in past collapsing systems. The pressure is not coming from a single source. It is the result of multiple forces converging at once, creating an environment where stability becomes increasingly fragile. One of the clearest signs is the widening gulf between northern and southern economies. Historically, empires destabilized when their regions could no longer share a unified trajectory, when the more productive centers became frustrated with the burden of supporting weaker territories, and when the weaker territories became overwhelmed by obligations they could never realistically meet. Europe's version of this dynamic is visible in the structural imbalances embedded in the Eurozone. Nations like Germany maintain trade surpluses and strong industrial output, while countries like Greece, Italy, and Spain operate under persistent fiscal stress. This divergence creates a cycle where financial assistance becomes political resentment, and political resentment becomes economic fragmentation. It is a replay of the internal contradictions that fractured the Austro-Hungarian Empire and undermined the cohesion of the late Ottoman state. At the same time, Europe's demographic decline amplifies every economic tension. A shrinking workforce, aging populations, and rising pension obligations create long-term commitments that exceed the productive capacity of many member states. Historically, systems facing demographic contraction struggled to maintain the tax base needed to sustain their obligations, and Europe is no exception. The fiscal imbalance grows year after year, not because of short-term mismanagement, but because the underlying demographic engine no longer generates the energy that once sustained European prosperity. This is the same dynamic that contributed to the stagnation of the late Roman Empire, where a shrinking productive class struggled to uphold a system that demanded more than it could provide. Another fault line emerges from the political fragmentation that accompanies economic strain. As living standards stagnate and government credibility weakens, support shifts toward more radical parties promising protection, restoration, or rupture. This trend is not a modern anomaly. It is a historical constant observed in nearly every pre-collapse society. When economic tensions become too severe, political unity dissolves. Today, Europe faces rising separatist movements, nationalist parties, and deep ideological divides that make coordinated economic action increasingly difficult. Each election cycle introduces new volatility, and each policy negotiation becomes more polarized, revealing a system losing its internal cohesion. And behind these tensions lies an often overlooked factor: the loss of economic synchronization between the continent's core institutions. Central banks struggle to stimulate growth without triggering inflation. Governments attempt reforms that face immediate public resistance, and the gap between financial narratives and lived reality widens. This dissonance is a classic marker of systems entering the advanced phases of the collapse pattern, where the economic engine still runs, but the alignment needed to support it has already fractured. Europe's internal tensions are not surface-level turbulence. They are systemic indicators of a structure entering the later phases of decline. And as these pressures intensify, they create the perfect conditions for the next stage of the pattern to emerge with even greater force. As the internal tensions intensify, one of the most decisive and irreversible shifts begins to unfold: the erosion of the middle class, the social layer that historically acts as the stabilizing force of nations. When this segment weakens, the system loses its anchor, and the path toward collapse accelerates. Europe is now living through this transformation with a clarity that mirrors the crucial turning points of past civilizations. The middle class does not vanish overnight. It erodes slowly through economic pressure, declining opportunity, and a growing sense that the promises of the past no longer match the realities of the present. In earlier cycles of collapse, the weakening of the middle class marked the moment when social resilience began to break. In the late Ottoman Empire, merchants and artisans found themselves squeezed by rising taxes and foreign economic control. In the decades leading to the French Revolution, professionals and skilled workers were burdened with financial obligations, while the aristocracy remained insulated. In the Soviet Union of the 1980s, educated workers watched their purchasing power evaporate as the system failed to provide meaningful advancement. Europe today reflects these same conditions, not through abrupt shocks, but through a gradual suffocation of economic mobility. One of the most visible drivers is the rising cost of living, which continues to outpace wage growth. Housing has become inaccessible in many major European cities, leaving younger generations locked out of wealth accumulation. Energy prices fluctuate unpredictably, straining household budgets. Taxes increase to sustain expanding public commitments, while disposable income shrinks. The middle class finds itself working more, earning relatively less, and feeling the weight of responsibilities that previous generations could manage with far greater ease. This imbalance creates not only financial stress, but also an emotional fracture, a sense of betrayal that fuels societal discontent. Parallel to this is the stagnation of upward mobility. Education, once a pathway to stability, increasingly leads to burdens without equivalent opportunity. Skilled workers find themselves competing in saturated markets or navigating industries disrupted by automation, outsourcing, and declining competitiveness. The pathways that once defined the European dream are narrowing, and as they do, the middle class begins to feel the same pressures that historically pushed populations toward radicalization or disengagement. When the foundation of society no longer believes the system works, the system inevitably destabilizes. All of this interacts with the broader economic fragmentation already shaping Europe. As governments struggle to balance budgets, they reduce benefits, raise taxes, or pursue austerity measures that disproportionately affect the middle class. Public services weaken, infrastructure ages, institutional trust declines. These are the same warning signals observed in the twilight years of past powers, when the social contract thinned to the point of rupture. Europe's middle class is not disappearing because of a single crisis, but because the underlying economic architecture can no longer sustain the expectations it once promised. And as this group weakens, the entire system becomes vulnerable to the shifts that follow, creating fertile ground for deeper instability. As the middle class weakens and social stability thins, another layer of the collapse pattern becomes visible: the slow, steady corrosion of institutions that once held the system together. Institutional decline does not erupt in a single moment. It spreads like a quiet fracture beneath the surface, only becoming obvious when the consequences are already irreversible. Europe now finds itself in this phase, where the structures meant to preserve order, trust, and continuity are losing their authority, echoing the same dynamics seen in past civilizations entering advanced stages of breakdown. In historical collapses, this erosion often began with a disconnect between official narratives and people's lived realities. Governments continued to present confident messages while the population sensed something entirely different. The same pattern is emerging across Europe. Public administrations struggle with delays, inefficiencies, and chronic underfunding. Courts face rising backlogs and declining credibility. Regulatory bodies appear increasingly political, rigid, or out of sync with real economic needs. Citizens interpret these failures not as isolated errors, but as symptoms of a broader institutional fatigue. This widening gap between perception and performance is a classic indicator of systems entering structural decline. Political institutions face similar fractures. Coalition governments, once a hallmark of European stability, increasingly struggle to form or function. Elections produce fragmented parliaments where no party can govern effectively. Policy cycles shorten as governments shift priorities to appease frustrated electorates, leaving long-term issues unresolved. Meanwhile, scandals, corruption allegations, and administrative mismanagement continue to erode the trust that once underpinned European governance. Historically, when political credibility weakens, societies become more susceptible to radical alternatives, which further destabilize the center. Economic institutions, particularly central banks, also confront their limits. For more than a decade, Europe relied on extraordinary monetary measures to preserve cohesion, but those tools have diminishing impact. Inflation rebounds when stimulus expands, recession risks return when tightening begins, and the delicate balance between price stability and growth becomes harder to maintain. In past empires, similar cycles occurred when financial systems could no longer mask structural weaknesses. Temporary interventions delayed collapse, but ultimately amplified the underlying fragilities. Europe's economic apparatus now faces the same dilemma: Decisions that once offered stability now deepen volatility. Even international institutions, once symbols of European unity, show signs of strain. Diverging national interests overshadow shared goals. Disagreements over migration, defense, fiscal rules, and energy policy reveal a system increasingly pulled in conflicting directions. Historically, when institutions designed to unify begin to fracture under pressure, the next stages of collapse become far easier to trigger. Fragmentation replaces cooperation, and systems built on consensus begin to crack. What makes this stage particularly dangerous is that institutional decline rarely reverses without significant restructuring. Trust, once lost, is hard to regain. Efficiency, once eroded, is difficult to restore, and legitimacy, once questioned, becomes vulnerable to further destabilization. Europe now stands at this intersection, where institutions carry the weight of expectations they can no longer fully meet, mirroring the historical tipping points that pushed past powers into the later stages of the collapse pattern. As institutional credibility weakens, another force begins to rise from the edges of the political landscape, the spread of radical narratives that promise clarity in a time of confusion, certainty in a moment of instability, and simple answers to problems that have grown too complex for traditional institutions to manage. This shift is not unique to Europe. It is one of the most universal markers of societies entering the later stages of the collapse pattern. When institutions falter and the middle class feels abandoned, the public begins searching for alternative visions, and those alternatives often come from movements willing to say what the mainstream refuses to confront. In previous collapses, this dynamic was always present. In the declining Roman Empire, radical sects gained influence as traditional authority structures weakened. In the final decades of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, nationalist movements transformed political fragmentation into ideological battles. In the Weimar Republic, social and economic dislocation created a vacuum that extremist movements quickly filled. Europe today faces a similar moment, marked by the growing popularity of parties and groups that reject the established order and present themselves as the only force capable of overturning a system perceived as broken. Economic frustration fuels much of this shift. When people feel their living standards declining, when opportunities shrink, and when the burden of survival grows heavier, they become more receptive to movements that frame the crisis as the product of deliberate failure or elite mismanagement. Radical narratives often offer an emotional outlet, transforming complex structural problems into targeted grievances, and once these narratives take hold, they redefine the political landscape, turning frustration into collective identity and anger into momentum. Another element accelerating this shift is the loss of trust in mainstream solutions. Traditional parties across Europe increasingly appear indecisive, fragmented, or unwilling to confront the deeper causes of crisis. Whether the issue is debt sustainability, demographic decline, border pressures, or economic stagnation, institutional responses feel cautious and incremental, while radical movements promise decisive action. This contrast creates a powerful perception that the center is hollow, incapable of meeting the demands of a changing world. Technology amplifies this dynamic even further. Social networks accelerate the spread of provocative messages, bypassing traditional media filters and allowing radical ideas to gain visibility at unprecedented speed. In previous eras, revolutionary ideas took years to circulate. Today, they can explode within hours. And because these messages tap into genuine anxieties, they spread quickly through populations already skeptical of institutional narratives. What makes this stage particularly important is how it interacts with the broader collapse pattern. Radical movements do not emerge in isolation. They emerge because the system that once managed tensions can no longer absorb them. They are a symptom, not a cause. But once they reach critical mass, they can become accelerators, pushing societies from institutional weakness into political rupture. Europe is now approaching that threshold, where the rise of alternative narratives signals not only dissatisfaction with the present, but a readiness to abandon the frameworks that once held the continent together. As radical narratives gain strength internally, an equally powerful force begins pressing from the outside. The geopolitical and economic pressures that expose how vulnerable Europe has become in the global landscape. No collapsing system exists in isolation. External shocks often act as accelerators, transforming internal weaknesses into systemic ruptures. Europe's current position reflects this exact dynamic, where external pressure does not simply add to the internal strain, but interacts with it, amplifying every existing fracture. And this combination is one of the most reliable indicators that a system is moving from stage 4 towards stage 5 in the collapse pattern. One of the most visible pressures comes from Europe's growing dependence on external energy, supply chains, and security arrangements. Historically, empires that relied heavily on external powers for essential resources eventually found themselves unable to maintain stability when those dependencies were disrupted. The Ottoman Empire lost control of grain routes, weakening its food security. The Soviet Union struggled when oil revenues declined. Today, Europe faces similar vulnerabilities. Disruptions in energy markets strain household budgets and industrial production. Global supply chain breakdowns expose how little manufacturing resilience remains within the continent. Each external shock reveals a deeper structural weakness that internal policies can no longer fully offset. Economic pressure from global competition adds another layer. Europe's productivity growth has slowed sharply compared to the United States and East Asia, creating a competitive gap that continues to widen. Industries once central to European dominance now struggle against more dynamic and scalable global competitors. As this gap expands, the economic foundation that once ensured prosperity weakens, and national governments face pressure to choose between austerity, protectionism, or unsustainable spending, each of which accelerates internal tensions. This is the same dilemma that confronted late-stage empires throughout history when they could no longer keep pace with rising global powers. Geopolitical fragmentation also contributes to the external pressure. Conflicts on Europe's borders, shifting alliances, and the emergence of competing power blocs create an environment where the continent must navigate global instability while managing its own internal fragility. Historically, external conflict often signaled the transition from decline to rupture. When a system already strained internally faces growing external threats, the margin for error disappears. Europe's security dependencies, combined with rising geopolitical volatility, place the continent at a strategic disadvantage that magnifies every internal division. And beneath all these pressures lies a fundamental shift in global monetary dynamics. As emerging economies explore alternatives to the dollar and experiment with new currency frameworks, Europe risks losing influence within the international financial order. For regions already facing structural instability, changes in global monetary architecture often accelerate the descent toward the next stage of collapse. Reduced influence means reduced leverage, and reduced leverage means reduced ability to buffer against external shocks. These external pressures do not create collapse on their own, but they trigger the next stage by converging with internal fatigue. And as this convergence becomes more pronounced, Europe moves closer to the threshold where the system can no longer absorb additional stress, pushing the continent toward a phase of irreversible transformation. As external pressures intensify and internal structures weaken, Europe enters one of the most revealing phases of the collapse pattern, the emergence of silent signals that rarely make headlines, but consistently precede major systemic breakdowns. These signals are subtle enough to be dismissed by those who expect collapse to arrive with dramatic events, yet strong enough to be recognized by anyone who understands how structural decline truly unfolds. Throughout history, collapsing systems reached a moment when the decline stopped being theoretical and became something felt in small interruptions, quiet distortions, and patterns that ordinary citizens recognized long before political leaders did. Europe is now experiencing this same phenomenon. One of the clearest silent signals is the gradual decline in state capacity. This is not a sudden failure, but a slow weakening in the ability of governments to execute basic functions. Processing times for essential public services become longer. Infrastructure maintenance falls behind schedule. Public systems that once operated smoothly begin to show signs of administrative fatigue. These may seem like minor inconveniences, but historically they signaled that the governing structure was losing operational efficiency, just as the late Roman bureaucracy struggled to maintain basic order, or as the Soviet administrative system grew sluggish in its final decades. Another subtle indicator is the fragmentation of public consensus. When a society is moving toward breakdown, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain unified narratives, shared priorities, or collective goals. Europe now faces deep divides not only between nations, but within them. Cultural tensions, regional divides, ideological polarization, and competing interpretations of economic reality all contribute to a landscape where common direction becomes harder to achieve. This erosion of consensus mirrors the social fragmentation that preceded the collapse of multi-ethnic empires, where once unified populations split into competing identities, seeking their own path forward. Economic synchronization also weakens during this phase. Markets begin reacting unpredictably to policy decisions. Small shocks reverberate more intensely than before. Growth becomes inconsistent across regions, and indicators that once moved in harmony start drifting apart. Historically, this misalignment marked the transition from manageable instability to structural fragility. In Europe's case, the uneven recovery after financial shocks, the divergence in debt trajectories, and the inconsistent performance of labor markets signal a system whose internal rhythms no longer align. A further silent signal lies in the psychological shift among citizens. As trust erodes and expectations decline, people begin adjusting their behavior in ways that reinforce the downward cycle. Families reduce consumption, delay investments, or relocate to more stable regions. Businesses hesitate to expand. Skilled workers seek opportunities abroad. These individual decisions accumulate into demographic and economic shifts that accelerate the decline. Similar trends were present in the waning years of past powers, when populations sensed change before leaders acknowledged it. All these signals operate beneath the surface, rarely creating the kind of spectacle that forces immediate action. Yet collectively, they reveal a system transitioning from stress to fragility, from pressure to systemic imbalance. Europe is crossing this threshold in real time, and once these silent indicators take root, the next stages of the collapse pattern become increasingly difficult to avoid. As the silent signals accumulate, the final layers of the collapse pattern begin to take shape through the convergence of multiple forces that on their own might be manageable, but together form a self-reinforcing cycle. This convergence is one of the most consistent precursors to systemic breakdown across history. It marks the moment when economic stress intersects with political fragmentation, social fatigue, and geopolitical tension, creating a structural environment in which each pressure amplifies the others. Europe has now entered this phase where the interaction between these forces becomes more consequential than any individual crisis. Economic fragility remains at the core of this convergence. For years, Europe attempted to manage structural weaknesses through policy adjustments, institutional reforms, and monetary interventions. But as productivity lags behind global competitors and debt burdens continue to rise, the economic foundation becomes too thin to support long-term stability. Historically, similar imbalances played a decisive role in accelerating collapse. In the late stages of the Ottoman Empire, economic stagnation combined with fiscal exhaustion to undermine political authority. In the final years of the Soviet Union, declining productivity and rising obligations created an unsustainable financial architecture. Europe's current trajectory reflects this same tightening pressure, where each new shock places the system under greater strain than the last. Political fragmentation magnifies this economic vulnerability. Coalition governments struggle to maintain cohesion, and ideological divisions become more pronounced with each election cycle. Trust in political leadership declines, fueling cycles of protest, polarization, and governance paralysis. Past civilizations experienced this same pattern when political institutions lost the ability to coordinate responses to growing crises. The inability to act decisively becomes itself a catalyst for decline, as delayed decisions compound existing tensions. Europe's political environment now exhibits these characteristics, where structural challenges meet institutional hesitation, and hesitation evolves into broader instability. Social fragmentation adds another layer to the convergence. As economic pressures deepen and political trust erodes, populations begin withdrawing from collective identity, shifting toward more localized or ideologically driven forms of belonging. This quiet disintegration mirrors the social unraveling observed in collapsing systems throughout history. Once the sense of shared purpose dissolves, the resilience of the entire structure weakens, making the system more vulnerable to shocks that would have been absorbed in earlier stages. Geopolitical vulnerability completes the convergence. External pressures from shifting global alliances, border conflicts, and economic dependencies interact directly with Europe's internal weaknesses. When a system already under strain faces strategic challenges beyond its control, the pathway toward the next stage becomes increasingly defined. Historically, collapsing powers reached this point when internal fatigue collided with external demands, leaving them unable to respond effectively to either. Europe now stands at this intersection, where its ability to navigate global pressures is constrained by its fragmented internal landscape. This convergence does not signal an immediate collapse, but it does mark the transition into a phase where the system's internal logic begins to shift. Stability becomes reactive instead of proactive. Solutions become temporary instead of structural. And each new challenge accelerates the system toward outcomes that become progressively more predictable. As all these forces converge, Europe moves toward the threshold where the system no longer functions under the assumptions that once defined it. This stage is not marked by a single event, but by a gradual shift in the internal logic of the continent. Decisions that once created stability now generate new tensions. Measures that once reassured the public now expose deeper fractures. The transition into the next phase of the collapse pattern happens quietly at first, in the spaces where institutions hesitate, where markets react unpredictably, and where populations begin adjusting their expectations as the familiar landscape loses coherence. Europe is entering this space where the gap between what the system promises and what it delivers becomes too large to bridge with minor adjustments. Throughout history, this is the moment when societies begin to sense that the old framework can no longer carry the weight placed upon it. In the late Byzantine Empire, reforms failed to revive an exhausted structure. In the final decades of the Habsburg Empire, attempts to stabilize the system only revealed how fragmented it had become. And in the final years of the Soviet Union, the internal imbalance grew so vast that even major restructuring could not reverse the trajectory. Europe now mirrors these conditions, not in the dramatic form many expect, but in the subtle, pervasive feeling that the system is moving toward a different state altogether. The signs are visible in the growing unpredictability of policy responses, in the accelerated movement of capital and skilled labor, in the widening distance between economically strong and weak regions, and in the public's shifting relationship with long-standing institutions. As this stage deepens, each decision interacts with pressures accumulated over years, creating outcomes that no longer reset the system but nudge it further along a path shaped by structural forces rather than political will. This is the essence of the fifth stage, a shift from active control to passive drift, where the system continues moving even when leaders attempt to redirect it. The most revealing part of this process is the psychological turning point among the population. When people no longer expect improvement, but adaptation, when the sense of long-term security gives way to shorter planning horizons, the system enters a new phase of existence. This shift doesn't break the structure in one decisive moment. It transforms the environment so gradually that only in hindsight does it become clear that a new chapter had already begun. Europe is crossing this invisible boundary now, carried forward by the accumulated pressures of the previous stages and the growing momentum of the forces shaping its future. And as this chapter unfolds, it becomes even more important for those paying attention to stay informed, connected, and aware of the deeper patterns at work. If you reached this point, it means the analysis resonated with you in some way. Share a comment saying the phrase, "I am with you until the end," so I know you followed this journey to its final step. If the depth of this investigation added value to your understanding, consider subscribing so you can continue exploring these patterns with me, and leave a like to help this message reach others who need to see it. And when you are ready to continue, there is another video waiting right here that expands on these ideas and connects perfectly with what we explored today. So click and keep going.